All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. Beautiful daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors. To thank Sammy and Malka Esterson for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sora Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, and Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim. We hope in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamos will have an aliyah, and the family a Nechama. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, and the schus of Refuah for Ruchama Aviva Bas Sheina Chana, as well as for Achal Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel, and Daf Yomi sponsors Shani Topper and family Le'ilui Nishmas, their beloved father and grandfather, Josh Gutman, Yoshua ben Yitzchak, Zichron Livracha, on the occasion of his 14th yahrzeit. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah, and the family a Nechama. And above with that, let us begin. So we are picking up in Meretz Hashem. Today's daf is Vav 6. We are picking up on Hamid. There's a lot to do today. Thank you for accommodating the earlier start. So we are picking up Rabosai at the two dots on Hamid Beis. Amar Mar 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, about 19 lines up from the bottom. So also we're actually continuing in the brisa that we began yesterday. So Amar Mar, Einli ela b'Nakhri shelo kibashto ve'in shari imcha b'chatzer. So remember again, we saw yesterday, I only know that halacha l'maisa, there's a potential issue regarding chametz when it comes to a Nakhri, who you do not dominate and does not go ahead and live in your chatzer. Nakhri shekibashto v'shari imcha b'chatzer. Also, from where do I know that a Nakhri, we'll say, Shino Lashon of Shekibashto, whom you dominate, that Yisod ultimately is who you are responsible for, or who is dependent on you, or an Nakhri who lives with you. From where do we know that there's a potential issue of chametz? Talmud Lomar, lo yimatzeh. Therefore, the pasuk says, lo yimatzeh. To which the Gemara says, that doesn't make any sense. Klapi laya. Understand how the Brisa reads. The Brisa makes it sound like that it's more obvious to say that there's a bal yimatzeh issue by a Nakhri who is not connected to you, and then the Gemara is looking for a source that there's a bal yimatzeh issue by a Nakhri who is connected to you. To which the Gemara says it's just the opposite. A Nakhri who is literally, again, who is subdued by me, who is dependent on me, or Nakhri who lives in my chatzar, it's much more mistabro, to appear to be much clearer that I would be in violation of Bal Yimatzeh for that individual's chametz than for a Nakhri who is totally not connected to me at all. Amrabai Epok. Sabai says, indeed, switch it around. And indeed, what the Brisa Rabosai means to say is as follows. The Brisa means to teach me that a Nakhri who is literally conquered by me, or a Nakhri who is living with me, that is the Nakhri for whose chametz I am responsible and therefore could be in violation of Bal Yimatzeh. Versus a Nakhri who is totally independent of me. Right? A Nakhri who just is not dependent on me, or a Nakhri who does not live in my chatzar, of course I'm not going to have any level of violation for his chametz. Rava Amarava says no. In fact, you have to do not switch around the Brisa. And in fact, this is referring to the beginning of the Brisa. What did the Brisa say? Shalcha atoroa aval atoro shalachem v'shal gavoa. So remember again, halacha l'maisa. The pasuk uses the word lecha, lo yirah lecha, lo yimatzeh lecha, which means it is only chametz which is yours that you are in violation. Ultimately, again, for chametz. You know, a number of years ago, I remember this is probably going back more than a decade, because I don't think they do it anymore. Remember, it used to be that the newspapers would sometimes include like these little boxes of cereal. You know, I was probably dating myself. I mean, this was occurred when I was in Baltimore, so it can't be so long ago. And I remember one time, it happened like on the 6th, 7th day of Pesach, where one of the local papers was running this thing, and like a box of Cheerios showed up on people's front lawn during Pesach. And again, obviously, as you could imagine, Baruch Hashem, Klal Yisrael, a bunch of tzaddikim, everybody, the one thing that a Jew does not want on Pesach, I might have cravings for many things. The one thing I don't want is a box of Cheerios. But again, everybody got very excited, but it's not really such an issue, because remember again, people often think that the issue of chametz on Pesach is seeing chametz, having chametz. The issue is possession. We're going to discuss this, but that's why it's lecha. It's lecha. So the Gemara says, The Gemara says, "Shelcha et hara." You are responsible for your own chametz, but ultimately, again, the chametz of a Nakhri, the chametz of a guy, the chametz of Hegdish, you're not responsible for. So we'll say, now watch this. Ainli ella, so we'll say, according to this approach, Ainli ella b'nachri shel kibashto, vein shar l'cham chabachatzer. Now I know, what I know that means is that I am not responsible for the chametz of a Nakhri, who I did not quote unquote conquer, or who does not live in my chatzar. But however, Nakhri sheki bashto b'sharim chabachatzer minayin. Rabbi say, from where do I know? This is really incredible. From where do I know that even a Nakhri whom I did conquer, or a Nakhri who does live in my chatzar, that I am still not responsible for his chametz? See, Rabbi say, what the Gemara now is highlighting is something quite fascinating. That perhaps what the price is coming to teach, Rabbi say, is that even people who may be dependent on me or connected to me still have the ability to possess their own independent chametz. And even though there may be a relationship of dependency, I am not responsible for chametz, which is not mine. So we'll see, you hear what's going on over here? So I understand, lo yirai lecha, lo yimatzi lecha. I understand I'm only chayiv for chametz, that's mine. And therefore chametz that belongs to a Nakhri who's unconnected to me, or chametz that belongs to Hekdish, I'm not chayiv for. Now the Gemara says, how do you know that even chametz of a Nakhri who, quote unquote, you have conquered, whatever that means, or who does live with you, how do you know that you also will not be in violation for that chametz? Because although this person is tethered to you in some way, they have the ability to maintain individual ownership, to which the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar, lo yimatzeh. Therefore the pasuk says lo yimatzeh. But says in Gemara, but one second. V'hai tana lehadra hatera v'nasa lekra lisura. They both say the Tana is looking for a heter, right? Remember again, we're looking for a pasuk to teach me that I will not be chayiv for a Nakhri's chametz, even if that Nakhri is somehow connected to me. And yet the Gemara brings a pasuk not of heter, but of isser, right? The pasuk of Bayimatze is a pasuk of isser. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, you're right, mishum ne'emar lecha, mishum shene'emar lecha lecha trezimni. So we'll say ultimately again, it says lecha twice. Lo yibrai lecha, lo yimatze lecha. So I don't need both of those lechas. Both of those lechas teach me that halacha l'maisa, it is only chametz that is owned exclusively by me that I am chayiv for on Pesach. Therefore, also it comes out from this Gemara, we're going to explore this concept in greater depth, is that there could be a situation of a person who has a quasi-dependence on you, but yet halacha l'maisa, you are not responsible for their chametz. For their chametz. So this could happen, this could happen in a variety of different ways. Sometimes this happens in halacha l'maisa setting. Let's say a person, this happens sometimes when people have workers. Let's say you have workers, and let's say again, you happen to give your workers a lunch stipend, right? And they go ahead and they buy lunch. And let's say again, it turns out that they have things over Pesach, they have chametz over Pesach. So we'll say that to a certain degree, if you think about it as like a Nakhri sheki bashto, you, so to speak, are kind of buying that food. But lamaisa, they have a sense of independence. So it goes without saying that when the chametz is totally unrelated to you, right? Unrelated to you meaning you don't own it, and the person who does own it has no connection or dependency on you, of course you're not chai for that chametz. What the Gemara is highlighting is even if the person who owns the chametz does have some connection and even some small level of dependence or reliance, as long as that chametz is truly and fully owned by that other individual, you have no liability for it. That's the takeaway. Again, we'll develop this more. Says the Gemara. We'll say first wide line. Amar Mar. We'll say some really interesting sugyas. Amar Mar. So Amar Mar. Yachol yatmin v'kal b'ktonos me'anachrin. So we'll say you might have thought that halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and store chametz or be mekabel pikadon. We spoke about this yesterday. Pikadon is a guarantee, right? You could be mekabel pikadon from Nakhrim of chametz. Tamlo lo yimatzeh. I ha'amrit shelcha yatara v'atara shelachim. Suppose say v'shal gavah. So remember again. So I don't understand. The Bryce has said before that you're not allowed to go ahead and store chametz for a guy, nor can you go ahead and be mekabel chametz as a pikadon, as a guarantee, right? It's the right word. Right? A guarantee, right? Or something you're watching for someone. So I'm not allowed to do that. So the Gemara says, why? Because it says lo yimatzeh. To which the Gemara says, but that's a contradiction. Ha'amrit reisha shalcha yataroa aval ataro shalachem v'shal gavoa. But I will say, but beforehand, what did we say? Earlier we said that halacha l'maisa, you're only chayiv on Pesach for your own chametz. So I don't understand. If the Nakhri asks me to watch his chametz for him, or even if he gives me a guarantee for something, I don't own those items. Those items are owned by the Nakhri. So why would I be chayiv? We'll say, here we go, this is incredibly important. Lokashya, hadu kabil alei achrayis, hadu lo kabil alei achrayis. So we'll say everything depends on whether or not you have responsibility for the items. Responsibility creates ownership in halacha. So if the Nakhri deposits something with me, and I am responsible for its safekeeping, and I will say, how does responsibility manifest itself? In the event, if something were to happen to that item, would I be obligated to replace it? If I'm obligated to replace it, I have full achrayis. Full achrayis is tantamount in halacha to ownership. So if the Nakhri deposits something with me and I have responsibility for it, I'm actually going to be over on Bayi Rabbi Matzeh. Versus, if the Nakhri just puts something in my house, but I have no personal responsibility for it, then ultimately it's the Nakhri's chametz, not mine, and I'm not in violation. What does Rav said to Bnei Mechuzah? What did Rav say? Be'iro chamira dibnei chila mibataychu. Kevan dilu mignav vilu misa b'shusaychel koi ubaisu l'shlumi kidil chodom v'asru. So Rav said to the people of Mechuzah. So apparently the people in Mechuzah were obligated to house soldiers. So it used to happen, Rashi points out, is the soldiers would bring their own like flour, dough, chametz products. They would store it in the homes, and then the balabatim there would prepare the meals for the soldiers. So Rava said to the people of Mechuzah, you need to get rid of that chametz before Pesach. Why? Because what would happen in general if you were to lose the chametz of the soldiers? You would be obligated to replace it. Whenever you're obligated in replacement value, that shows ownership. Therefore, you must get rid of that chametz. Hani chalaman damar. So we'll say this makes sense according to the opinion who says davar hagar lemamon kimamon dami. That Rabbi says something which causes financial loss is the equivalent of money. So in this case, Rabbi say, because if the householders were to lose the chametz of the soldiers, they would be obligated to replace it. Therefore, halacha lemaisa, it's treated like actual money. Elaman damar lav kimamon dami. But Rabbi, according to the opinion who says davar hagorim lemamon, Rabbi says actually an interesting machlokes. If something causes you to spend money, but it's not actual money, is that called money? So we'll say that's this case, right? The soldiers deposit flour with me. If I lose the flour, I have to pay back the soldier. That's called the davar hagorim lemamon. Says that mamon, not mamon. So if you say davar hagorim lemamon kim mamon dami, then it makes sense that Rava told them to get rid of the chametz because they own it. How do they own it? Because if they lose it, they have to pay it back. But if you hold davar hagorim lemamon eino kim mamon dami, then ma'ika lememar. To which the Gemara says, "Shiny hachav da amar lo yimatzei." I will say here it's different because the pasuk says lo yimatzei, which means you really can't have around any chametz to which you have any level of ownership interest. So even if you hold davar hagorim lemamon lav kimamon dami, at the end of the day, you can't have in your possession any chametz that you own in any way, shape, or form. Ika da amri, we'll say an alternate version of this exchange. Hani chalaman damar davar hagorim lemamon lav kimamon dami. So it makes sense according to the opinion who says that davar hagorim lemamon is not kimamon, right? That's something that causes you to pay money. Is not the exact equivalent of money. Hainu tap of vav, hainu deitzterich lo yimatzei. We both say, therefore, the pasuk of lo yimatzei comes along and says as follows: even though we normally say davar hagorim lemamon eino kimamon dami, and therefore, under normal circumstances, the fact that you have to pay back the soldiers for the flour or for the chametz would not be considered financial ownership. So the Gemara says, therefore, hainu deitzterich lo yimatzei. Therefore, the pasuk by chametz tells me lo yimatzei, and lo yimatzei tells me that what? That halacha l'maaseh, even though I would normally say davar hagorim lemamon eino kimamon dami, by chametz it's different, and by chametz any level of ownership interest will be absolutely problematic. However, elaman da'amar kimamon dami lo yimatzei lamali. I will say according to the opinion who says davar hagorim lemamon, that which causes you to have to pay money is the equivalent of financial interest itself. So therefore, why do I need lo yimatzei? Sakadait chamina hol v'chi isei hadar be'inei lav b'rshusik. Because I might have thought as follows: when it comes to the soldiers, I will say, let's say again, the soldiers were to be redeployed somewhere else. So what would happen? Any leftover food that I have that belongs to the soldier, what do I do with it? I give back the food as is. I give back the food as is. I don't go ahead and give back money, I give back the food. So listen to this. I would have thought that because I give back any unused food as is, therefore, halacha l'maisa, it's not really like I own this, right? It's not like I own this, and therefore I'm not over on Bal Yimatzeh. Kamash Molo, no. Kamash Molo both say that halacha l'maisa, any level of ownership interest in this situation, even though I'm giving back the food exactly as is, if there's anything left over, I'm still in violation of possessing it on Pesach. So both say, what you begin to see is something quite interesting, which is, although the halachas of financial ownership may be a little bit different in general in Yonim of Choshen Mishpat, right? General business law, by chametz, any level of ownership is going to be problematic. Next case, so these are really fascinating cases. Let's say here's a fascinating kash that came from Rava. Here we go. Behemas arnona chayeves bebechora inu chayeves bebechora. So listen to this case. Look at Rashi. Arnona, it's right across. Hamelach notel ishur min ha-behema min ha-tvos. So we'll say, let's say you live in a locale where the king takes 1/10 of your flock and 1/10 of your wheat. So we'll say, here's the shaila. So now I have an animal, part of my flock, and I have a bechor animal. But yet the king is going to take 1/10 of my flock. So therefore, again, what does that mean? The king has an ownership interest in my flock. So what's the shaila? Chayeves bebechora or eno chayeves bebechora? Is my animal, or is my flock, or is my firstborn animal chayiv in bechor or not? Let's remember again, bechor behema is the halacha that we give the firstborn animal to the kohen. So when the king takes a tax from my flock, am I obligated still in bechor behema? Now what's the shaila? Take a look at Rashi. Chayeves bebechora. Rashi says the kaimalon kol sheyad Nakhri be'emtza petura min ha'bechora shene'emar li kol bechor b'Yisrael avalo ba'achirim ve'eder zeh she'Yisrael shel melech b'socho chayeves. So here's the shaila. The halacha is, let's take a simple case. If I were to own an animal in shutfus, in partnership with a Gentile, that animal would not be subject to the laws of Bechar Behema. That's the halacha. Why is it, Rabbi Say? It's based on a simple pasuk, Kol Bechar B'Yisrael. Because the Torah makes it sound like, because the Torah on this tells us that halacha l'maaseh is only an animal that is solely owned by Jews. By Jews, that is subject to the halachos of Bechar. So Rabbi says, see the shaila over here? Shaila over here is, the king doesn't own a specific animal in my flock, but the king does have an ownership interest in my flock, and that he gets 10%. So does the king's financial interest in my flock exempt my animal from Bechar Behema or not? It's quite fascinating. So what do we say? So the Gemara says, Kol heicha dematzi mesach leibizuzei lo komi bailan dechayeves. So we'll say, whenever you could kind of pay off the king. What does it mean pay off the king? So we'll say, so the king has a financial interest in my flock, right? He owns 1/10 of the flock. So there are two ways you can satisfy that debt. I could literally give him 1/10 of the flock, or I could just pay money. So wherever you could satisfy your obligation just by paying money, that means you could lift the king's hold on your flock, right? You could lift the king's, I'll call it lien against your flock. If you could remove the lien against the flock with financial payment, then the king is not viewed as having financial interest. And if the king is not viewed as having financial interest, then what? Then ultimately, again, I am chayiv in Bechar Behema. So Kikami Bailan, we'll say, where does the shaila come up? Heicha, delo matzi misalek le bezuze. So we'll say, where does the shaila come up? The shaila comes up where I can't pay off the king. So we'll say, where I can't go ahead and take care of this obligation through financial payment, but the king demands livestock. So what's the halacha? Amar lehu petura. Ultimately, again, so he responded, in such a case, I will say, where I can't pay off my obligation, but I must give animals from my flock. Therefore, this is considered to be a flock that is jointly owned with the king, and therefore pater from Bechar Behema. But once we have a brayso that says Yechayiv, to which the Gemara says Hasam dematzi misalek later. Both say that was a different case. That was a case where you could pay off the king's obligation with money. So if you could pay off the obligation with money, then Einachinami, the king, is not considered to have a financial interest in your animals. And if he doesn't have financial interest in your animals, then ultimately, again, it is chayiv in Bechar Behema. Ikadan will say an alternate version of this, Amarava, Behemas arnona petura mina bechora, va'afagav dematzi misalikle. Also listen to this. In the alternate version here, we have it as follows: that halacha l'maisa, if the king demands a tenth of your flock, such an animal, right, a bechor from that flock is exempt from bechor behema. Exempt. Why? Because the king has a financial interest. It's a partnership with a Gentile, and therefore it's exempt. And even though you could technically pay off the king's interest with money and not with an animal, nevertheless, ultimately, the Bechar Behema will still be pater, or you'll still be pater from Bechar Behema. Rashi points out something amazing about this. Rashi points out, why is that? Look at Rashi. Because Rabbi say, it's very nice that potentially you can pay off the king, but Lamaisa, until if you have not paid off the king, then the king's lien is there. And if the king's ownership interest in your animal is present, it is pater from Bechar. You hear that? Such an incredible musar. What's the musar? That Lamaisa, it's very nice you can do something, right? It's very nice to have potential to do something. Potential means very little. What matters in life is not the potential you have. What matters in life is what you do with that potential. So it's wonderful that you have the ability to pay off the king. That's fantastic. But Lamaisa, you haven't. So because you haven't, the king has an ownership interest in your animal. Because it has an ownership interest in your animal, therefore it's pater from Bechar. So we'll say, so where the Gemara is holding right now in this alternate version is, under all circumstances where the king demands a tenth of your flock, halacha l'maisa, such an animal is exempt. Such a bechar in that flock is exempt from bechar behema. Why? Because it is considered to be an animal jointly owned by Jew and Gentile. And any animal jointly owned by Jew and Gentile is exempt from bechar behema. What about the following case? The Gemara says, however, isas arnona. They both say, what about the following situation? Let's say I have a doe. Literally, again, will say dough. I have dough, and let's say in the place that I live, so the halacha is that the king takes a portion of every dough. That's the way it works. So we'll say, so what's the shaila? The shaila is, am I obligated to be mafresh challah? Am I obligated to separate challah from such a dough? Because as Rashi points out, the Torah says, reishis arisosechem. You shall take from the first of your dough. Once again, your dough means what? Dough owned by a Jew and not dough owned jointly by Jew and Gentile. So that's the shaila. So the shaila Rabbi say becomes ultimately again, if the king takes a portion of the dough, halacha l'maisa, is that dough subject to challah? To which the Gemara says, isas anona chayavis b'challah, afagav lo matzi misalikle. But the Gemara says, yes, the halacha is that dough, even if the king demands an actual portion of the dough, and you can't satisfy that obligation by paying him money, it's still going to be chayiv in challah. We'll say, why would it be chayiv in challah? At the end of the day, is that not jointly owned dough? To which the Gemara says, here we go. My taima, behema islay kala, isa less like kala. Because we'll say, here's the difference. The difference is, with animals, everyone's going to know that the reason you're not going ahead and taking or setting aside bechar behema is why? Because the king takes a portion, right? I will say livestock is something that is much more public versus dough, which is something which you do inside of your home, and therefore halacha l'maisa, because it's private, people won't understand why you're not being mafresh challah. Suppose essentially what it becomes like almost is like a maris ayin issue. So therefore halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says is as follows: if the king demands a tenth of your flock, whether you could pay off that obligation with money or not, or you have to give livestock, halacha l'maisa, my animal is pater from bechar behema, because that is considered to be a jointly owned animal, and any jointly owned animal is not subject to halachos of bechar. But if I have a dough, right, and the king demands a portion of the dough, even in a situation where halacha l'maisa, I have the ability, right? I have the ability to go ahead and pay him off with money. I still have to separate out challah from that dough, because people won't realize, if I don't separate out challah, people won't realize the reason I'm not doing it is because it's a jointly owned dough. They will just think that I'm being derelict in the mitzvah. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, one has an obligation to separate out challah no matter what. Okay, I was saying incredible. That was just bonus material. Now back to chametz. Tanar Abanan. Nakhri shenichnas lechatzero shel Yisra. So we'll say, here we go. A Nakhri who goes into the chutzner of a Jew, u'b'tseiko biyado, and his dough is in his hand. So we'll say in this case over here, he's mamish walking in and he's holding his chametz. Ein zakuk levair. Ultimately, again, the Yisrael Rabbosai has no obligation to destroy that chametz, which Rabbosai is not a chiddush, right? Why doesn't he have any obligation to destroy that chametz? Why not? It's not his. So he just established before, right? Now remember, why does the Gemara even have to state such a case like that? Because remember, chametz is coming into my property. See, what's unfolding over here is chametz is being brought into my property, but I have no ownership interest over that chametz. So the Gemara says, because it's the Nakhri's, he's coming in, I have no obligation to go ahead and destroy it. Hifkido etzlo, but if the Nakhri deposited that chametz with me, then zokok levair. Then I am obligated to go ahead and destroy that chametz. Because Rabbi say the assumption is that if he's depositing it with me, then halacha l'maisa, I have achrayis, I have responsibility for it. Well, the moment you have achrayis, that's ownership. Once there's ownership, there's an obligation of biur. However, the Gemara says, yichi lo bayis. What happens if halacha l'maisa, I set aside, yichi lo bayis literally means I went ahead and set aside a home for the Nakhri to deposit his chatzah. What it means, I will say, it doesn't have to be a home. I set aside a spot. I told the Nakhri, put your chametz in that corner. Now Rashi says very yicha lo bayis kilomar lo kiblu alav ela amra le hari abayis lefanecha hanach ba'achas min hazavios in zagor. So let's listen to this. So I'll say if the Nakhri comes in and essentially I say, listen, you're more than welcome to put your chametz in that corner. Halacha views that statement. Rabbi say that I'm giving him place to put his chametz, but I'm taking no responsibility over that chametz. So what's the halacha? If I just give him space to deposit his chametz, I'm not taking responsibility, then ein zakuk levair. Then I have no obligation to destroy that. Chametz shnei amar lo yimatzei. Because ultimately, again, the pasuk says lo yimatzei. So it says the Gemara, my kamar, how exactly does lo yimatzei teach me anything that you just mentioned? Here we go. We'll say, Amar papa reishakai. The pasuk lo yimatzei is actually going on the first case. What's the first case? Vachi kamar hifkido etzlo zakok levair. If a Nakhri deposits chametz with me, I'm obligated to destroy it because I will say, when it's a pikadon, the assumption is what? I have achrayis, I have responsibility. Well, if I have responsibility is ownership, and therefore I'm obligated to destroy the chametz, to which the Gemara shenemar lo yimatzei, because the pasuk says lo yimatzei. Ravashi says no. The olam seifa. No, in fact, the lo yimatzei is going on the second part of the brayz. What does the brayz say? Vachi kamar yichid lo bayis in zakuk levair. If you set aside a home, or meaning also what it means is I set aside a place for the Nakhri to deposit his chametz. Yichid lo bayis ein zakuk levair. Ultimately, again, I am not obligated to go ahead and destroy the chametz. Shene'emar lo yimatzei bivasechem. Because ultimately, again, the pasuk says, you shall not find chametz in your home, meaning your chametz. V'hai lav didehu. And at the end of the day, this is not my chametz. When I tell the Nakhri, you could put down the chametz in the corner of my house, but I take no responsibility for it. The fact that the chametz resides in my property, as we already saw this, does not create ownership. To which the Gemara says, because ki kama'ayel lebeisa, the nafshe kama'ayel. When the chametz ultimately comes into my home, it's the Nakhri's own chametz. It's not my chametz. Lememra, the schirus kanya. So I'll say, this is very interesting. So essentially what you're telling me is that I'm effectively renting a corner of my home to the Nakhri. And when I rent a corner of my home to the Nakhri, whose property does it become? Whose property does it become? The Nakhri's. Right? Because what it sounds like is happening over here is as follows. Remember, two cases. Case number one is where the Nakhri brings the chametz and I take responsibility for it. It's a pikadon. So then it's my chametz. I'm in violation of bayimatzei. Masha'inking, the Nakhri brings in the chametz. I say, listen here, feel free, put it down in the corner over there. Put it down in the corner over there means I'm essentially giving him space, but taking no responsibility over the chametz itself. So we'll say what that means essentially, says the Gemara, is that when you rent an area to someone, they become the full owner over that area. So the Gemara says, is that true? Vatanya, af b'makom shomer lahaskir lo. So we'll say, listen to this. The Gemara here is talking about in Avodah Zarah, about the about the prohibition to sell property and even to rent property to non-Jews in Eretz Yisrael. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, "Af makom shomer lahaskir beparak kaman d'avodah zarah tanan Ein maskirin batim lenachrim be'eretz Yisrael. We do not rent homes to non-Jews in Eretz Yisrael. Aval b'Surya maskirin, but in Surya you can. V'chol shekein b'chutz la'aretz. V'af b'makom she'tir lahaskir lo lebeis tirakir. So listen to this. So the halacha is you're not allowed to sell property to non-Jews in Eretz Yisrael, and even renting you're not allowed to. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Af b'makom she'amru lahaskir. Even when the rabbis allowed you to rent a property to a non-Jew, lo lebeis dira amru. They did not allow you to go ahead and rent it out for domicile purposes. Why? Because after all, as they say, home is where your avodah zarah is, right? And therefore, again, what's the concern? If I go ahead and I rent a domicile to a Nakhri, he's going to bring in his avodah zarah. But one second. But I don't understand. If, as we just said, that renting it, Rabosai, when I rent area to a Nakhri, who becomes the owner of that space? Who becomes the owner? The Nakhri. They let him bring in whatever he wants. What do I care if he brings in his avodah zarah? Essentially, he's the owner. Remember again, what did we just say? We just said before that when the Nakhri brings in his chametz, and I tell him what? Put it down in the corner over there. What's happening halachically over here? What's happening? I'm effectively renting him that corner. And he becomes the owner of that corner, and therefore the chametz is not mine. I have no responsibility for it. The chametz is his, which tells me that rental is tantamount to ownership. But one second, the Gemara says, I'm not allowed to rent out a domicile, or I'm not allowed to rent out a home for a Nakhri to live in, because maybe he's going to bring in his avodah zarah. But I don't understand. If rental is like ownership, then why can't I rent a home to a Nakhri? And even if he brings in his avodah zarah, that's not my problem. It's not my problem. It's not, effectively, it's not my home. He's doing whatever he wants to do in his own home, so why should that be a problem for me? To which the Gemara says, Shiny let's say first wide line. It's different over here. Why is it different over here? Because the Torah frames the prohibition of chametz with a lashon of lo yimatzei. Mi shematzei biyadcha yatza zeh she'eno matzei biyadcha. So we'll say lo yimatzei. Lo yimatzei ultimately again means the Gemara actually lo yimatzei biyadcha. Is it ultimately found in your hand? And found in your hand is a lashon ultimately again of direct ownership. So really in this case over here, it's possible that schirus doesn't really represent full ownership. But lamaisa for Pesach, for Chametz, I'm really only chayiv for a more personalized direct ownership. So it could be in general that when you rent out a space, so the renter still retains some level of ownership over the space. But lamaisa, when it comes to chametz, the prohibition is lo yimatzei, misha matzei biyadcha, and ultimately, again, it's Rashi says shematzei biyadcha, shari osa zavis mesur lenachri. Even if the rental is not full ownership, lamaisa, I'm giving over that corner to the Nakhri. And once I give it over to the Nakhri, therefore halacha lamaisa, it's really out of my domain. Good. I'll say Amar Rav Yudam Rav. We'll say, listen to this interesting case. Hamotzi chametz beveso biyamtiv. We'll say, what happens if you find chametz in your home? You find chametz in your home on Pesach. On Pesach. So we'll say, specifically on Yom Tov. This is not Chalamayid, because Chalamayid, if you find chametz, you burn it. Remember, on Pesach itself, on Yom Tov itself, you can't burn chametz. That was yesterday's daf. Right? And Allah Chalamaisa, Havara is permitted, right? Kindling of Havara is permitted for Ochel Nefesh purposes, would not be permitted for destruction of chametz. I will say, now remember, once you can't burn chametz on Pesach, so chametz on Yom, when I say Pesach, I'm referring to Yom Tiv. On Yom Tiv, then chametz is muktzah. Muktzah. Once chametz is muktzah, you can't. So what do you do with it? If you find a boss, this is like the worst nightmare. Finding a piece of chametz. Basically, the Arizal brings down. Mishnah Berurah quotes the Arizal who says that if you don't find any chametz over Pesach, that is a skula that you're going to be able to combat your Yetzer Hara for the year. It's a good incentive to clean one's home very thoroughly, right? Because it happens very often. You stumble upon some chametz when you didn't think about. If you do a proper job in cleaning your home, which makes sense because the cleaning of the physical home is supposed to represent, supposed to spur us to clean the spiritual home of chametz as us. The Arizal said if you did a good enough job, you were alacritous enough and diligent enough with your physical home, Kadosh Baruch Hu will give you the siyata d'shmaya to properly keep your spiritual home cleaned as well. But this person obviously didn't. So what happened? He finds a piece of chametz in his home on Yom Tiv itself. So what's the halacha? Kolfe alav esakli. You put a utensil over it on Pesach, on Yom Tiv. Just supposed to say this way again, no one touches it, no one eats it, no one moves it, nothing. And then chalama, you burn it. So the Gemara says, look at Rashi. Rashi says, the halo chazle taltule, you're not allowed to move it. Now the good news, remember again, we're going to talk about this towards the end of today's daf. Remember, we do two things. We do bedika and bittul. Right? We search for chametz and we also nullify or render ownerless all of our chametz. That way, again, this guy, when he finds chametz on Pesach, the good news is it's not his chametz. Right, because he was already mevatel, he already rendered it ownerless. But nevertheless, he wants to be careful. He doesn't want anybody to come and eat it. Therefore, he puts a kli over it for Yom Tov. Amarava, im shal hekdishu eno tzarech. But if the chametz he found was hektish chametz, he doesn't even have to put a kli over it. Why? My time. Because we'll say since it's hektish, a person in general is used to not consuming hektish. So we're not concerned that the person may come to inadvertently consume it, since throughout the entire year a person stays away from hektish. We'll say similarly, Rav says, what happens if you have chametz of a Nakhri in your home? Now we'll say this is a little bit different. This is a case where before Yom Tov, a Nakhri deposited chametz with me, but I don't have achrayis for it. I have no responsibility, right? So we'll say my neighbor deposited his chametz, right? He's got a nice scotch collection. Whatever the reason, he asked me if he could store it in my home. I said, no problem. Here's a corner. I have zero responsibility for that chametz. So I say, therefore, again, on a technical level, it is no problem for that chametz to be in my home because I have no ownership over it. So what do? However, oselo mechitza asar tzvachim mishum heker. I will say, but what I should do is I should put up some type of mechitza. In other words, that chametz should not be in plain sight, but rather I should make a mechitza at least of 10 tvachim. We'll say taking us back to our Eruvin days, right? So ultimately, again, so I should make a mechitza at least 10 tvachim to demarcate the area. Dim shal hekdishu, but if the chametz is of hekdish, then what? I don't have to make any type of mechitza. Again, same idea. My taima mivdal bedile inish mine, because we'll say generally people distance themselves from hekdish. So let's listen to this interesting halacha. What if you're going away for Pesach? Oh, I take that back. You're going away before Pesach. So what's the case? Now we're going to translate the words, but then we're going to have to amend what the case means in just a moment. So let's say somebody's leaving their home before Pesach. Kodim shloshim yom. If you're leaving more than 30 days before Pesach, in zakuk levayer. Ultimately, again, you are not obligated to do a bedika. Bedikas chametz. Toch shloshim yom. But if you're leaving your home within 30 days before Pesach, zakuk levayer. Then ultimately, again, you are chayav to do a bedika. Says Gemara, 1 second. Amar Abaye. Had the amri toch shloshim yom zakuk levayer. When we say that if you're leaving within 30 days, you have to do a bedika, that's only when lo amran ela shadaita lachzar. I will say, remember again, if you're leaving within 30 days, when do you have to do a bedika? That's assuming that what? You're coming back on Pesach. You're coming back on Pesach itself. Aval ein daita lachzar, but I will say if your intention is not to come back, ein zakuk levayer, then there's no obligation for bedika more than 30 days. Amrli Rava says 1 second. The daita lachzar. If you're going away, we'll say sometime before Yom Tov, and your intention is to come back on Pesach itself, afilu me Rosh Hashanah nami. We'll say, remember, let's say you're going on a little bit of a sabbatical, you're leaving your home before Rosh Hashanah, but you're coming back on Pesach, Lamaisi, you have to do a bedika before you leave, because you're coming back on Pesach. If you're coming back home on Pesach itself, you must make sure that before you leave your home, the home is chametz free. Otherwise, you're going to come back to a home that has chametz inside of it on Yom Tov itself. Rava reframes the halacha. Here we go. So we'll say, when we say that if you leave your home before 30 days, you aren't obligated to do a bedika. We'll say that's only assuming that halacha l'maisa you're not coming back for Pesach. But if your intention is to come back, then afilu me Rosh Hashanah zakuk levar. Then ultimately, again, even if you leave Rosh Hashanah, you're obligated to go ahead and do the bedika. So we'll say, interestingly enough, what comes out from this Gemara is as follows. If you are leaving your home sometime before Pesach, before 30 days, after 30 days, doesn't make a difference, and your intention is to return on Pesach, therefore what? You must do a bedika before you leave. And I will say that's just intuitive. Right? If I'm going away sometime before Yom Tiv, 25 days or 75 days, and I'm not coming back till Pesach itself, I have to make sure that I'm coming back to a home which is ready for Pesach. The novelty here, I will say, is that halacha l'maisa, what if I'm going away and not coming back? I'm going and not coming back, meaning not coming back, I'm not coming back till after Pesach. So I will say, then the halacha is, if I'm leaving within 30 days, then ultimately I have to do a bedika, even though I'm not coming back till afterwards. But if I'm leaving before 30 days, I don't have to do a bedika, which is another way of saying that the obligation of bedika devolves upon a domicile within the 30 days before Yom Tiv. But if you are leaving more than 30 days before Yom Tiv and not returning to your home for Yom Tiv, then halacha l'maisa, no obligation of bedika. Let's explore this more. But Rav Latameh, I will say Rava goes according to his reasoning, because what does Rava say? Da Amar Rava ha'ose beisa otzar kodim shloshim yom ein zakuk levar toch shloshim yom zakuk levar. Let's listen to this case. What's ose beisa otzar? So if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says otzar, second to last line from the bottom. Shehechnis sham tevua v'tachteh chametz. Listen to this case, Rabbi say. We're going to see later on that if you have chametz that's buried under a pile of rubble, you don't have to remove the rubble to get the chametz to destroy it before Pesach. Rather, chametz covered by rubble is considered to be destroyed. So the interesting point over here is as follows. Let's say you have a storehouse. You have chametz on the floor of the storehouse, and then you pile wheat. And remember, wheat is not chametz. You pile wheat on top of the chametz. Now, the chametz is buried by a large pile of wheat. Are you obligated to go in there and clear out the wheat and get the chametz? To which the Gemara says, it depends. If you poured in the wheat to the storehouse before 30 days, then there's no obligation to go out and get the chametz. The chametz is considered to be like buried under a pile of rubble, inaccessible, and therefore it's considered as if it's burned. But if you piled on the wheat onto the chametz within 30 days, then what? You are obligated to go in there, get the chametz from underneath the pile of grain, because we'll say again, what's the idea? Within 30 days, the obligation of bedika has already begun. To which the Gemara says, furthermore, I will say, even before the 30 days, you don't have an obligation to clear out the pile of wheat, only when you're not going to be clearing out that wheat over Pesach. However, we'll say if you're going to be clearing out the wheat from the storehouse sometime over Pesach, then ultimately, again, obviously, even before 30 days, we would be obligated to seek out the chametz. So we'll say, you begin to see this idea from Rava, that the obligation of bedika devolves upon the home within 30 days before Yom Tov. So therefore, again, if you're leaving your home within 30 days, even if you're not coming back for Pesach, you have to go ahead and clean the home. Right? You have to clean the home. Even if you're not coming back. You're leaving before 30 days. If you're coming back, you still have to clean. But if you're not coming back, you don't have to clean. So say, where does this come from? Where does this idea of 30 days? We'll say, so here's what we know. And we'll say, this is codified in Shulchan Aruch. So if I'm leaving my home within 30 days, even though I am not going to be on for Pesach, we'll say, this is Maisim B'chol Yom, where, right, people going for Yom Tiv. So Pashas, most people who are going for Yom Tiv are not usually leaving. I'm talking about like you're going like to a program or something. You're not leaving Erev Yom Tiv, you're leaving sometime beforehand. So there's a famous shayla that comes up. Do I have to do a badika or not? Am I obligated to do a badika? So I'll say, this is it. What's the answer? Am I obligated to do a badika? Yes. Assuming, I'm sure it's only a matter of time until someone comes up with a Pesach program that begins 31 days before Yom Tiv. I am sure it'll happen just to avoid the bedika. But Lamaisa, if you're leaving your house within 30 days before Yom Tiv, halacha Lamaisa, you have to do a bedika. You have to do a bedika. That's the halacha. Now, with a bracha, without a bracha, we'll discuss. And we'll say that's true, even though I know I'm not coming back for Yom Tiv. Now, we'll say, what we will discuss is something very interesting. What we will discuss is the halacha concerning selling your property as a whole and what that does to bedika. Let's say I'm not just selling a room where my chametz is. I'm not going to be home for Pesach. I'm happy to rent out my entire home. We'll see what that does due to the obligation of bedika. But pashtus, you're leaving your home within 30 days before Yom Tiv. You must do a bedika. Where does 30 days come from? Why is that the window? So here we go. So the Gemara says, because what said the halacha is that within 30 days of a Yom Tiv, you must go, we learn the halachas of the Yom Tiv. So we see already this concept. This is Maseches Megillah. 30 days before Yom Tov, we begin to learn the halachas. So you begin to see that 30 days, I will say that what? 30 days already, there is a certain atmosphere or a certain element, identity of the Yom Tov that has already arrived. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, no, shtei Shabbosas. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, no, you don't have to learn the halachas of Yom Tov 30 days before Yom Tov, but rather you have to learn the halachas of Yom Tov only 2 weeks before the Yom Tov. My time at the Tanakama. So we'll say, where does the Tanakama get 30 days? Amud Beis. Shah, Hare Moshe Omid bePesach Rishon. Umasya Pesach Sheni Shneim Arbayasu Bnei Yisrael Pesach Amado Uksiv Vahiyan Vashma Shayu Tmeim L'Nefesh Adam. So both say the Tanakama is very simply Moshe Rabbeinu teaches the people about Pesach Sheni when it is still Pesach Rishon. So remember again, both say Pesach, what we call Pesach, is the 15th of Nisan. Pesach Sheni is the 15th of Iyar, a month later. So what do you see? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was teaching the people about Pesach Sheni when it was still Pesach Rishon, tells us that there's a concept of learning the halachas 30 days before the arrival of a particular Yom Tov. Well, both sides. Once I have the concept of learning the halachas of 30 days before the Yom Tov, then what? That tells me that there's a certain level of Yom Tov identity which devolves upon the days that devolves upon the 30-day period prior to a Yom Tov. Therefore, again, the Gemara will understand. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, the chiyuv b'dika, the chiyuv to check for chametz, already devolves upon a home within 30 days before Yom Tov. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer, Amar Lacha. Rabbi Shimon will say that's not a raya. The fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was teaching on Pesach Sheni during actual Pesach, that's not a raya. Aidi da'ayri b'mili de pischa, masik luhu dechol mili de pischa. Rabbi Shimon will say simply, only reason Moshe Rabbeinu talked about Pesach Sheni during Pesach Rishon also is for a very simple reason. Once we're talking about Pesach, let's just talk about all the elements of Pesach. In other words, I would say the Tanakama takes it as a raya that since Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about, remember again, we'll say Pesach Sheni is the makeup Pesach, right? The individuals who are unable to bring the Karban Pesach at the original time have a makeup date, right? If they weren't able to do so either because they were Tameh, Obadach, Rechoka, they were too far away, they have a makeup date on Pesach Sheni, a month later. So Tanakama says, the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu was standing on Pesach and talking about Pesach Sheni, that tells us that you have to start preparing for Yom Tov 30 days before the Yom Tov. Rabbi Shimon says, that's not a raya. It's just Moshe, remember again, they asked him, since they asked the Shaila, and Moshe was talking about Pesach anyway, let's just talk about all the aspects of the Yom Tov of Pesach. What's there to talk about? To which the Gemara says, my time to Rabbi Shimon. So we'll say, what's Rabbi Shimon, right? Suppose Rabbi Shimon says, you're only obligated to go ahead and learn about a Yom Tov 2 weeks before the Yom Tov. Okay, so where does that come from? Listen to this. Shari Moshe Omi B'Rosh Chodesh Umasya Ala Pesach. Because Rabbi say, it was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and Moshe Rabbeinu was teaching Klal Yisrael about Pesach. So also remember again, Pesach is 2 weeks after Rosh Chodesh. So the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu stands on Rosh Chodesh and teaches the people about Pesach 2 weeks later tells us that you're only obligated to begin preparing for the Yom Tov 2 weeks beforehand. Shene'emar hachodesh hazel lachem rosh chadoshim, because the pasuk says this month will be for you the first of all months. That's Rosh Chodesh. Uksiv dabru el kaladas bnei Yisrael lemar be'asar lachodesh v'yikchu lahem ish sela beis avos sela bayis. So we'll say ultimately again, you see that it's Rosh Chodesh. Moshe Rabbeinu was standing on Rosh Chodesh, and halacha l'maisa, he's teaching them about Pesach. So Rabbi Shimon therefore disagrees with the Tanakama. That's whereas the Tanakama says you have to start learning about the halachas of a Yom Tiv 30 days before the Yom Tiv. Rabbi Shimon says 2 weeks. 2 weeks. To which the Gemara says, I don't understand. Mimai tiberesh yarchakai. How do you know that when Moshe Rabbeinu says Achodesh hazel lachem rosh chadashim, how do you know that he was saying that on Rosh Chodesh? Maybe Dilma ba'arba b'yarcha b'chamisha b'yarchakai. I will say maybe halacha l'maisa. Moshe Rabbeinu was giving over this information on the 4th or the 5th of the month. And I was both saying, we always assume that Moshe Rabbeinu was giving over the halachos of Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Chodesh, but maybe not. Maybe he was giving over the halachos of Rosh Chodesh on the 4th or the 5th of the month. Rather, Rabbi Shimon learns out the 2-week obligation from here. Here we go. Vaydaber Shema Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'shana hashenis b'chodesh harishon. So the pasuk says that Hashem spoke to Moshe in Midbar Sinai during the second year, in the first month. Second year in the first month. So we'll say, so the pasuk, right? In the first year, say, good. And then what does it say? Uksiv vayasu b'nei Yisrael as Pesach b'moado. And the pasuk says that Klal Yisrael will do the Pesach in the appointed time. So we'll say, so here you see pretty explicitly that Hashem is speaking to Moshe when? On Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Remember again, it's Shana Hashem, his second year, Chodesh Harishon, first month, and then God is giving Moshe Rabbeinu the instructions for Karban Pesach in the second year. So we'll say, so here you see an example of the halachos of Pesach being taught on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, 2 weeks before. So Rav Shimon says, therefore, this serves as the paradigm that you have to start preparing for any Yom Tov 2 weeks before. To which the Gemara says, again, Hakanami, Mimai Debereish Yarchakai. I will say, how do you know that this is happening on Rosh Chodesh? Remember again, does the pasuk say it's happening on Rosh Chodesh? Does the pasuk say that? No, what does the pasuk say? When is it happening? Second year, first month. So I know that it's happening in Chodesh Nisan. Do I know that God is talking to Moshe on Rosh Chodesh itself? There's no indication of that. Maybe God is talking to Moshe on the 4th or the 5th of the month, maybe only 10 days before Pesach. You're right, so that says the Gemara, Amram Nakhri bar Yitzchak, Asya Midbar. In fact, Rav Shimon requires a Gzer Shava of Midbar. Here we go. Ksiv Hacha b'Midbar Sinai. It says over here, by Karban Pesach, Midbar Sinai. Uksiv Hasam, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe, b'Midbar Sinai, b'Oel Moed, be'echad l'chodesh hasheni. Rabbi say this is by the census, the beginning of Bamidbar, right? So Rabbi say in the beginning of Bamidbar, literally the first pasuk of Bamidbar, Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Bamidbar Sinai, b'Oel Moed, be'echad l'chodesh hasheni, on the first day of the second month. So Rabbi say it uses the same notion of Bamidbar, ultimately by the census, and Bamidbar by Karban Pesach, right? When God instructs Moshe about Karban Pesach. So just like Ma'ala Halon Barosh Chodesh, we'll say just like the use of the word Midbar by the census means that God was communicating to Moshe on Rosh Chodesh, albeit in the second month of Iyar, Af Kan Barosh Chodesh, so too over here, we'll say when it says that Hashem spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu about the Karban Pesach, Bechodesh Harishon Bamidbar. But Midbar teaches us that God is communicating to Moshe Rabbeinu when? Not just in the first month, but when? When? On Rosh Chodesh of the first month. So we'll say from here you see that Hashem communicated to Moshe regarding the Karban Pesach on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And from here, Rav Shimon says, the halacha l'maisa, you have to learn the halachas of any particular Yom Tiv 2 weeks before the arrival of that Yom Tiv. So the Gemara says, by the way, the Gemara says, v'nichtov bereisha, I'm sorry, Mala halon Rosh Chodesh, Afkam Rosh Chodesh. V'nichtov bereisha the Chodesh Harishon, v'adar nichtov the Chodesh. So we'll say, interestingly enough, there's a bit of a problem with chronology. It appears that the command to take the census was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the second month of the year, and yet Karban Pesach, of course, was commanded by Hashem on Nisan. Yet in the Torah, in Chumash Bamidbar, the obligation to go ahead and take the census appears before the obligation to bring Karban Pesach. Says the Gemara, why doesn't the Torah follow chronology? Right? But see, you hear what's happening over here. The obligation, the mitzvah of the census is Bamidbar Aleph Aleph. But yet chronologically that occurred after Karban Pesach, which is a little while later. To which the Gemara says, Amrav Menashe Bar Tachliv Mishrei Derav, we'll say incredible, Zos Ameres, Ein Muktam Umu'uchar Batorah. Wow. I will say, see, here we go. Says the Gemara, you're right. What does this teach us? A profound yisod. The Torah does not necessarily follow a chronological sequence. I will say, I want to be clear on something. This does not mean that there's no chronology in the Torah. Of course there's chronology in the Torah. But as I think about it, obviously almost all of Chumash, these stories are all following. What it means, Emuktu Mu'uchar Torah doesn't mean there is no chronology with Torah. What it means is that the Torah does not always follow a chronological sequence. V'haraya, the census, which takes place in the second month of the second year, is mentioned before Karban Pesach, which was done in the first month of the second year. To which the Amar Papa Amar Ela B'Trein Yane. So now we qualify this. Rav Papa says, when do we say Ein Muktam Mu'uchar Torah? That's only in two different topics, right? So say, so in other words, we assume that halacha l'maisa, right? That B'Trein Yane means two parshios. The Torah does not have to follow a chronological sequence in two parashios. Aval bechad inyana, mai de mukta, mai de mu'uchar. But I will say ultimately, again, in one parasha, right, in one section, we assume it is a chronological sequence. In other words, we'll say, when will we say in mukta mu'uchar b'Torah? That's in two parashios. But in one parasha, there's absolutely a chronological sequence. The ilo teimachi, because we'll say, if you say there's no chronology even in one parasha, that's significantly problematic. Why? Klal uprat, Gemara says, because klal uprat, im b'chal ala masha b'prat, dilma pratu klalhu. V'su pratu klal nasa klal mosef ala prat, dilma klalu pratu. So we'll say, again, I just want to point out, without getting into this right now, I will say, one of the exegetical principles is a klal uprat. Well, klal uprat only works if what? If the order of the psukim, everyone say klal is a general statement, prat is a limiting statement. So we have a klalu pratu klal, and these are darshan in different ways. Well, those drushes only work if what Rabbi say, if you assume that the psukim are in the order that they're supposed to be. So obviously, it goes to that statement, even if you hold in mukta mu'uchar b'Torah, even if you hold that the Torah does not follow a chronological, doesn't have to follow a chronological sequence, that's only in two parshios, right? Two sections. But in one parsha, it's absolutely a chronological sequence. Ihachi, afilu b'trenyon. Rabbi say, even if you hold that the Torah doesn't have to follow a chronological sequence in two parshios, hani chalamandamar klalu prat hameruchakin zemizein danin also b'klalu prat shapir. So I'll say that makes sense according to the opinion. This is fascinating. Who holds that a klalu prat, Rabbi say, you can only darshan if what? If they're next to each other. But if they're far away from each other, let's say two different parshas, you can't darshan klalu prat. Then I will say, ultimately, again, it makes sense because then you could say a mukta mu'uchar b'Torah applies in two parashos but not in one. El lemandar danin ma'ikala meimar. But I will say, according to the opinion, it says that you could darshan a klalu prat even if they are in separate parashos. How can you ever do that? After all, doesn't the problem of chronology throw off the potential klalu prat limud? The Gemara says, afilu mandamar danin hani mili b'chad inyana. Aval betray inyone ein danin. So we'll say ultimately again, to which the Gemara says, at the end of the day, really the only way to darshan klal uprat Rabbi says bechad inyona, one parsha. You can't darshan a klal uprat in two different parshios. Ultimately, again, I will say why not? Because exactly is what we just said. Because halacha is really fascinating. Because I will say we do accept the principle of ein muktam umu'uchar b'Torah, which again does not mean the Torah has no chronology. No, what it means is the Torah is not bound by chronology. But ultimately, again, that only applies in different parashos. In one parasha, we assume chronology is followed, which is why really the only way to truly darshan klalu prat is how? To darshan it within one parasha. So the psukim don't say have to be next to each other. They don't have to be next to each other. Although we'll say there is a school of thought that says no, you can only darshan klalu prat from psukim that are mamish next to each other. But even if you don't hold the psukim have to be next to each other, they still have to what? They still have to be what? They have to be in the same parasha. Because we'll say if they're not in the same parasha, then it's not necessarily clear which one, so to speak, is first, which one is second. So even if you hold in klalu prat that the psukim can be a little bit further apart, they must still be within the same parasha. We'll just start one line of the next sugya, but this will be tomorrow's sugya. I just want to give you coming attractions to whet your appetite a little bit. I'm going to review Rav. Habodich tzarich shei batal. I will say even if you do bedikas chametz, you still have to do bittul chametz. My taima. What's the reason? So we'll say, we'll say we're going to stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Mirat Hashem with, so again, we'll say just coming attractions for tomorrow's daf. We're going to learn daf Mirat Hashem tomorrow afternoon together. We're going to start getting into, now here's what we've established. We have not spoken about bittul at all, right? Bittul, if you notice again, bittul has not come up. The notion of making your chametz hefker has not come up in our discussions. Our discussions have been fully focused on the notion of bedika. But the obvious question that's going to come up is why are both mechanisms necessary? What role do both of them serve? And Miraz Hashem, we will see tomorrow. I will say, Yesha Koyach, and a good Shabbos to everyone.
I'm not charging you for this, by the way. This is free, just an idea. I went over your list, and I only spent about 10 minutes on it.
Incredible, thank you.
Think there's
Shkoyach, thank you.
just, there might be a few things on there that I wasn't
Perfect. So this is, you want to sponsor this?
Yeah.
Incredible, incredible.
Paper. It's just like I want to come to your chair.
Thank you. Overwhelmed. No, I'll take a look. Thank you. Good morning, good morning.